Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today we're diving into a topic that feels incredibly important right now, Muslim and non-Muslim relations. And we're using Professor Jamal Badawi's paper, Muslim and Non-Muslim Relations, Reflections on Some Qur'anic Texts.
It's a really solid choice, I think. This paper cuts through a lot of the noise and gets to the core of how Islam views those interactions, with other faiths, and it really tackles those misconceptions head on.
I'm already hooked. One thing that jumped out at me right away was Professor Badawi's emphasis on understanding the Quran within its historical and textual context.
Oh, absolutely. It's
Okay.
like you can't just pull a random sentence from, let's say, a Shakespeare play
Yeah,
and expect to really understand its meaning, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
So much gets lost without that context.
Yeah, you need the whole picture. And the
Mhm.
same applies to sacred texts, right? Trying to understand them without that context, well, it leads to misinterpretations. And frankly, we've all seen way too many of those floating around out there. It's so important to remember that what individuals do doesn't always reflect the true teachings of their faith.
So true. It's like judging an entire orchestra based on one off-key note.
Perfect analogy.
Now, Badawi also emphasizes the Quran and Hadith as those primary sources, and then he brings in these ideas of scholarly consensus and analogical deduction. To be honest, those sound a lot intimidating.
I can see why. Let me try to break it down. Scholarly consensus basically acts as a system of checks and balances for interpretations, almost like legal precedent, but for religious rulings. It ensures that interpretations aren't just someone's personal opinion, but are grounded in a continuous chain of knowledge going back to the Prophet Muhammad himself.
So it's about really careful, reasoned analysis, not cherry-picking versus to fit an agenda.
Exactly.
That makes a lot more sense.
Okay.
Okay, so let's get into those core principles for how Muslims are supposed to approach relationships with people of other faiths. What stood out to you the most from Professor Badawi's paper?
I'd say the emphasis on our shared humanity and those universal values really struck me. Islam's belief in one God, Allah, as the creator of everything. Well, it instantly establishes that interconnectedness. We all come from the same source.
We're all branches on that same giant tree of creation.
I love that.
And I noticed that Professor Badawi also talks about the concept of the unity of prophets.
Right. Muslims believe in all prophets, including those revered in other religions. It's not about claiming my prophet is better, but recognizing this long line of messengers guiding humanity throughout history. And I think that fosters a natural respect for other faiths.
Such a powerful idea, and it seems like that respect extends to every human being. Professor Badawi points out that the Quran is very clear about universal human dignity.
Yeah, it doesn't matter what you believe. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect. It's a fundamental principle, like the cornerstone of Islamic ethics.
And what I found fascinating was how he connects this to our role as God's trustees on earth.
Oh, that's a good point. It's like we're entrusted with caring for each other and the planet, not just for ourselves, but as a sacred duty.
Wow, that's a huge responsibility. And it really makes you think about your actions in a whole new light.
Yeah,
That sense of responsibility seems to tie into another principle, too, universal justice.
absolutely. Islam stresses justice for everyone, even your enemies. It's a prerequisite for true peace. You can't have one without the other.
It really challenges how we usually think. Instead of just focusing on your own group, it's about fairness and balance for all.
Reminds you of something else. Badawi discusses that idea of human brotherhood.
Yes, the Quran is so clear about that common ancestry. We all come from the same place, and it promotes unity in the midst of all our diversity. It acknowledges all our different beliefs and backgrounds, but emphasizes that ultimately we're all family.
We're all threads in the same tapestry, each one unique but woven together to create something beautiful and whole.
I love that. And within that tapestry, there's this principle of plurality. God allows for different beliefs. This really resonated with me. It's like you can be devout in your own faith and still acknowledge the right of others to believe differently. It reminds me of something else. Badawi emphasized no compulsion in faith.
That's so important. You can't force someone to convert. That's completely forbidden in Islam. The Quran really focuses on that respectful invitation and dialogue.
It has to be a genuine belief, freely chosen, not coerced or imposed.
Exactly.
This aligns with that idea of universal mercy that Badawi talks about. Muslims are commanded to show mercy to all beings, including those of other faiths. It's not just about tolerating other beliefs, but actively being compassionate and kind.
It's such a beautiful ideal, and unfortunately one that's often overlooked in these conversations about Islam, peaceful coexistence. That should be the norm. And I found it interesting that Badawi specifically highlights dialogue with the people of the book.
Ah, yes, Jews and Christians.
Yeah.
He mentions that the Quran encourages Muslims to engage in respectful dialogue with them, focusing on those shared values and beliefs.
Oh. Yeah, it makes sense, right? There's so much common ground already. A belief in God, revelation, ethical principles. It creates a really natural space for meaningful conversation.
It's like recognizing we're all reading from different chapters of the same book. That dialogue seems crucial for breaking down those stereotypes and building bridges.
Yeah.
But speaking of stereotypes, I think a lot of people have questions about jihad and how that fits into this picture of peaceful coexistence.
Yeah, jihad, it's one of the most misunderstood concepts out there. It's often translated as holy war, which, by the way, isn't even a phrase in the Quran.
And Professor Badawi really addresses that directly. He points out that jihad actually means to strive or exert effort.
And it's not just about physical fighting either. There's that social jihad, which is striving for truth and goodness in your relationships. And personal jihad, that inner struggle against your own weaknesses.
It's like always striving to be the best version of yourself for yourself and for everyone around you. So the idea of fighting is just one aspect of jihad, and even then it's very specifically defined.
Exactly. Professor Badawi explains that combative jihad is only allowed for self-defense or resistance against oppression, never, ever to force conversion.
It's about protecting the innocent and resisting injustice, not about some kind of religious domination.
Right.
I also appreciated how Badawi provided that historical context. The first verses that allowed for self-defense weren't revealed until after the early Muslim community had endured years of persecution and aggression.
Context is key. Those verses came at a time of intense conflict and have to be understood within that historical framework, not as blanket statements about all non-Muslims. In fact, he even mentions that the Quran allows fighting against other Muslims if they are the aggressors.
So it really boils down to addressing that oppression regardless of who is doing it. It's not about religious identity, but about standing up for justice. And even within that combative jihad, there are very strict rules of engagement.
Absolutely. The Prophet Muhammad was very clear about the humane treatment of prisoners of war and prohibiting harming non-combatants. It's crystal clear that Islam does not endorse indiscriminate violence or killing in the name of religion.
It's about upholding justice and protecting those who are vulnerable, even in those really difficult circumstances.
That's powerful. And honestly, it challenges a lot of the narratives we see in the media. I know people still point to certain verses in the Quran, like 9.5, as proof of intolerance towards non-Muslims, but it sounds like those verses are often taken out of context.
Oh, they are. And verse 9.5 is a perfect example. That verse has nothing to do with the people of the book, the Jews and Christians. It's talking about a specific group of idolaters who had broken treaties and were actively attacking Muslims.
So it's not about condemning all non-Muslims, but a very specific situation with a lot of historical complexities. We'll definitely need to unpack that further. We will, and we'll do that in our next segment, along with some other common questions and objections. But before we do, what's standing out to you so far from what we've discussed? What's resonating? It's interesting. It's those verses about fighting that often get the most attention, while the Quran's broader message of peace and compassion gets kind of pushed aside.
It's like focusing on one tiny brushstroke in a huge detail painting.
Right.
You miss the whole point. So you're going to break down verse 9.5 for us.
Yeah.
Sounds like there's more to it than meets the eye.
There is. That verse is often misunderstood as like a command to kill all non-Muslims, which is just not true at all. Context is so important here. The verse is specifically addressing a group of idolaters who had broken peace treaties again and again and were actually attacking Muslims.
It's about self-defense in a very particular historical situation, not about their beliefs.
Exactly. Imagine if someone broke into your house and threatened your family. You have a right to defend yourself, right? But that doesn't mean you go around attacking everyone on your street.
That's a great way to put it. And it makes me think of something else Professor Badawi mentioned. Even when the Quran allows for defensive fighting, it's never presented as a good thing. It's like a last resort, something that's disliked, but sometimes necessary to protect yourself.
Right. And even then, there are those strict rules in place. The Prophet Muhammad taught Muslims how to behave on the battlefield, emphasizing humane treatment of prisoners of war and absolutely forbidding harming non-combatants.
So it's not about seeking out conflict or hurting people randomly. It's about protecting the vulnerable and making sure there is justice even during a war. That's a perspective that I think gets lost sometimes.
I think so too. And it's important to acknowledge that throughout history, there have been times when Muslims haven't lived up to these ideals. But those actions don't represent true or normative Islam.
It's like in any other religion. You'll have people who distort the teachings to justify their own actions. But you can't judge a whole faith based on the actions of a few. It's like saying all classical music is bad because you heard someone play a violin concerto badly once.
Exactly. It's about going back to the source, understanding the real principles, and acknowledging the diversity of interpretations and practices within every faith.
So we've talked about those verses about fighting and self-defense. What about those verses some interpret as saying Islam has to dominate all other religions? Is it about some kind of religious imperialism?
That's another big misunderstanding that Professor Badawi clarifies. Those verses do talk about Islam prevailing, but not through military or political force. It's not about forcing people to convert.
So what does Islam prevailing actually mean then?
It's about the truth and beauty of Islam's message spreading and having a positive influence. It's about winning hearts and minds through things like reason, compassion, and setting a good example.
Like the power of a beautiful melody. It can move people across different cultures and languages without any need for translation.
I like that. And Professor Badawi points out that historically, Islam spread much faster during times of peace than during war. Think about those merchants and Sufi mystics traveling the world. They shared their faith through trade and interaction, and by simply living their lives. It wasn't about conquest or forcing anyone.
That's really interesting. It really challenges that common image of Islam spreading by the sword. It seems like peace dialogue and genuine connection were just as important, if not more so.
Absolutely. And the fact that Islam continued to spread even when Muslims weren't in positions of power shows that it wasn't about force or building an empire. It was about the power of the message itself.
Okay, that makes sense. What about that claim that the Quran says Muslims can't be friends with Jews and Christians? That seems pretty harsh at first glance.
It does, but that interpretation is based on a mistranslation. The word often translated as friends actually means something closer to protectors or allies, and it's being used in a very specific context. The verses using this word are talking about situations where groups of Jews or Christians were openly hostile towards Muslims.
So it's not about all Jews and Christians, but a warning against forming alliances with people actively working against you. Which makes sense in any situation, not just a religious one.
Exactly. Professor Badawi also reminds us that the Quran specifically allows Muslim men to marry Jewish and Christian women. That level of intimacy wouldn't make much sense if friendship was completely forbidden. It's all about understanding the language and the historical context.
It's like solving a riddle. You need all the pieces to understand what it really means. Okay, one last question that I know a lot of people have. Why does the Quran call some Jews and Christians kufar, which often gets translated as infidels? It just sounds disrespectful.
That word does have some strong connotations, and the translation infidel doesn't really capture the whole meaning. It's really important to understand that kafir, or kuf, has different meanings depending on the situation.
So it's not always about rejecting God like the word infidel implies.
Not at all. Sometimes it's used in a really neutral way. Like think about a farmer covering seeds with soil.
Uh-huh.
That's a form of kuf in that it's about covering something up.
That's interesting. So how does that relate to the spiritual meaning?
Spiritually, it can mean rejecting the truth, like hiding God's message. But even then, it's not always about denying God completely. It can also mean being ungrateful or even doing something wrong as a Muslim.
So it's way more nuanced than just unbelief. It's about the situation and the intention behind it.
Right. For example, when the Quran refers to some Jews and Christians as kufar, it's not saying they don't believe in God. It's acknowledging they have different beliefs or maybe reject certain prophets or teachings, but it's not saying they're infidels in the way we understand that word today.
That makes sense. The Quran is very clear that the God of Muslims, Jews, and Christians is the same God.
Exactly. It's not about denying their faith. It's about recognizing those differences in understanding, which honestly happens even within the same faith. Context is crucial.
Context is everything. It's not about oversimplifying or generalizing, but really getting into those details. I'm curious about the accusations of anti-Semitism that are sometimes directed at Islam, especially regarding events in Medina during the Prophet Muhammad's time. It's a sensitive topic, but I think it's worth addressing.
It is, and we should approach it with sensitivity and historical accuracy. First off, it's just plain wrong to call the Prophet Muhammad anti-Semitic. He was a descendant of Abraham through his son Ishmael, which makes him a Semitic himself. And the Quran speaks very highly of Moses and other Israelite prophets. It even describes the Torah as a source of light and guidance.
So there's a clear respect for Jewish tradition in Islam's own holy book.
Absolutely. Any criticism of Jews in the Quran isn't about Judaism as a whole. It's about specific actions or maybe distortions of their original teachings. And that's not unique to how Jews are addressed. The Quran also criticizes wrongdoing by Christians and even Muslims. It's about pointing out injustice and holding people accountable no matter what their religion is.
It's about what people do, not about condemning a whole group. It's about upholding those universal principles of justice and accountability we talked about before.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that the Prophet Muhammad set up a multi-religious constitution in Medina called the Sahifa. This document gave equal rights to everyone, including Jews. He wasn't trying to exclude or persecute them. He wanted a just and peaceful society where people of all faiths could live together in harmony.
That's really different from what we often hear. Yeah. But what about the times when the Prophet Muhammad did punish some Jewish tribes? How do those events fit into this idea of peaceful coexistence?
It comes down to the historical context. For example, take the tribe of Banu Qurayza. They were punished because they broke the constitution of Medina and sided with the enemy during a war. It was a matter of treason, not religious persecution.
So it was about their actions, their betrayal of a shared agreement, not about their religion.
Exactly. And the punishment they received was actually based on the laws of the Torah, which they had chosen to be judged by. It wasn't some random or religiously motivated punishment. It followed the established legal system of that time.
That's a really important point. It shows that it was about upholding the agreed-upon rules and principles, no matter who broke them. It wasn't about targeting a specific group because of their faith.
And it's important to note that only that specific tribe was punished, not all the Jews in Medina.
That's a crucial distinction. It shows a commitment to fairness and not punishing everyone for what a few people did. It's about holding individuals responsible for their choices within a system of justice.
Precisely. I think that's one of the key takeaways from Professor Badawi's work. Understanding these historical events means carefully considering the context, the details, and the complexities of the situation. We can't apply our modern understanding of anti-Semitism to a completely different time and place.
That's so important. It's about being aware of history and sensitive to those nuances. Okay, we've discussed a lot. We've tackled some difficult questions, and I think it's clear that what the Quran says about relations with non-Muslims is much more complex than a lot of people realize. Professor Badawi has really given us a lot to think about.
He has, and I think one of the biggest takeaways is just how important dialogue, critical thinking, and questioning our own assumptions is.
We can't just accept those surface-level interpretations or sound bites that we hear so often. We have to go deeper, ask questions, and engage with the text and the historical context in a thoughtful way.
I agree completely, and I think that's what we've tried to do in our conversation today, move beyond those generalizations and explore how complex this topic really is.
It's been a fascinating conversation so far, and I feel we've only just begun to explore this.
There's so much more to talk about. In our next segment, I want to shift gears a bit and talk about how these principles of peace, justice, and coexistence can actually be put into practice in the world today.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What does it look like to actually live out these ideals in a world that often feels so divided?
That's the question we'll be exploring, and I think it's something we can all relate to regardless of our beliefs or background.
Okay, so we've explored some of those core Islamic principles, those guidelines for how Muslims are supposed to interact with people of other faiths. But how do we actually put all of this into practice in the real world? Where do we even begin?
That is the question, isn't it? And I think the first step is recognizing that we're not going to create some perfect interfaith utopia overnight. It's a journey. It's going to take patience and persistence and a willingness to learn and keep growing.
No magic wands, huh? Sounds like it's a long game.
Yeah.
But with all of the challenges out there, what gives you hope? What makes you think that we can actually move towards greater understanding and coexistence?
Honestly, I find hope in those little everyday acts of kindness and understanding that I see happening all around us. It's about all those people and organizations working so hard, often behind the scenes, to build those bridges and challenge those stereotypes.
It's those efforts that don't always make it into the news, right? Those quiet acts of courage and compassion that really make the difference.
Exactly. It's the Muslim family inviting their non-Muslim neighbors over for Eid dinner. It's that interfaith group getting together for a community service project. It's that teacher who creates a classroom where every student feels safe and respected, no matter their background.
Those are the things that give us hope, right? Those little sparks of humanity that remind us that we're not as divided as the media might make it seem. It's like seeing those fireflies on a summer night.
Yeah,
They're a reminder that even in the darkness, there's still light and beauty all around us.
I love that image. And it's important to remember that progress isn't always a straight line. There will be bumps in the road challenges, times where it feels like we're actually moving backwards. But that doesn't mean giving up.
It's about remembering that this is a marathon, not a sprint, right? Building understanding and coexistence takes time and commitment.
Exactly. It's about those little steps, those daily choices we make. Challenging our own biases, reaching out to people who are different, speaking up against injustice whenever we see it.
It's like planting seeds of understanding, nurturing them with patience and compassion, knowing that they might take a while to grow, but trusting that they'll eventually blossom.
Beautifully put. And as we're planting those seeds, it's so important to celebrate those wins, no matter how small.
It's easy to focus on all the negative stuff, right? All those headlines and conflicts. But we need to acknowledge those moments of progress, those times when understanding and cooperation actually win.
We need to really savor those victories, share those stories of hope and resilience, and make sure those voices who are doing good are heard.
Because those positive stories have so much power, right?
Yes.
They can inspire us and remind us that change really is possible. It happens one interaction at a time, one conversation, one act of kindness.
And we need to support those individuals and organizations that are on the ground doing this incredibly important work, lending our voices and our resources however we can. Let's show them that they're not alone, that there are so many people who believe in a better future.
Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about Muslims and non-Muslims. It's about the kind of world we want to live in, the kind of world we want to pass on to our children and grandchildren.
It's about recognizing that deep down we're all connected. We're part of this human family sharing this one planet. And we have a responsibility to care for each other and for this earth, not just for our own good, but for everyone who comes after us.
It really makes you think about how much our actions, our choices, our words matter. It all creates a ripple effect, either driving us apart or bringing us closer together.
And those choices start with each of us in our own lives, in our homes, at work, in our communities. It's about choosing hope over fear, understanding over ignorance, love over hate.
That's a powerful way to end this conversation. It's a call to action, a reminder that we all have a part to play in building a more peaceful and just world. I think Professor Badawi would be happy with how we've engaged with his work and had this really thoughtful discussion.
I think so too. It's been a privilege to share these insights with you and with our listeners. May we all strive to be those beacons of hope, understanding, and compassion that the world needs so much right now.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.